I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of turnover in publishing because there's a lot of burnout in publishing. And according to Andrew, they would rather burn people out than hire more people. And I have to tell you that this scenario I'm about to describe, Andrew is not the first person who has worked at one of the big five to describe this exact scenario to me. A person in editorial or marketing or publicity or sales leaves their position and the boss tells the department, yeah, you can fill that position in 6 months. And they're like, but can we fill it now? And the boss says, no, 6 months. And they struggle and struggle for 6 months, and then 6 months passes, and the boss is like, look, you don't need that position. You've been doing it without that position this whole time, and then that position is gone. And an already overworked staff just got even more overworked. So I saw this Publishers Weekly article a few months ago actually, and it made me do a double take. Macmillan Publishers US Trade will raise its entry-level salary to $42,000 a year. The raise will apply to all incoming and existing employees and marks a $7,000 increase from what was reported to be Macmillan's baseline salary prior to the change, and makes Macmillan's entry-level salary among the highest, if not the highest, at the Big Five trade houses. The CEO of Macmillan Trade Publishing says, "We expect this change will help us expand our applicant pool by attracting candidates who have, up to now, found our starting salary too low." He added that the increase is part of Macmillan's broader diversity and inclusion program and commitment to pay equity. So to clarify, this is a brag from Macmillan. This entry-level salary of $42K a year, it's a flex. And the reason this kind of bowled me over a little bit is because that salary, $42,000 a year, that was my exact entry-level salary as a first-year public school teacher in a suburb of Dallas, Texas in 2003. Now, I want to make it clear right now that I am in no way trying to trash teachers or imply that editors should be making a lot more money than public school teachers. On the contrary, teachers are criminally underpaid and underappreciated, and don't come at me with all the "you get summers off" nonsense, because no, just because classes are not in session doesn't mean teachers aren't working all summer. Fight me. But look, okay, I had a bachelor's degree. I graduated in 2003 with a bachelor's degree in music education. I believe a bachelor's degree is a prerequisite to get into publishing as an editor or in marketing or in publicity. So we're talking about the same level of education here, no experience, entry level. And this is why I'm so offended. Macmillan, a wholly owned subsidiary of Holtzbrinck, a privately held company owned by Stefan von Holtzbrinck, net worth $2.7 billion, offers an entry-level salary for educated publishing professionals in Manhattan in 2021 that is equal to my taxpayer-funded salary as a public school teacher in a suburb of Texas 18 years ago. Let's look at how the cost of living in New York City compares to the cost of living in Dallas. You would need around $8,000 in New York, to maintain the same standard of life you can have with $4,800 in Dallas, Texas, assuming you rent in both cities. Consumer prices in New York are 50% higher than in Dallas. Consumer prices, including rent in New York, are 70% higher than in Dallas. Rent prices in New York are 100% higher than in Dallas, Texas. And that's compared to Dallas today. I don't have cost of living statistics for Dallas in 2003, but I can tell you that I had a very nice 2-bedroom apartment in a very nice area, and my rent was somewhere between $700 and $800 a month. HarperCollins Union posted a Twitter thread last December about how HarperCollins has the lowest entry-level pay of the Big Five at $36,000 a year, with the next lowest at $40,000. So yeah, Macmillan is flexing with that 42 grand. HarperCollins can't even match that, and who owns them again? Oh yeah, that guy. So we're looking at the Big Five offering baseline salaries ranging from $36 to $42K a year in a city where a single person's estimated monthly costs are $1,350, not including rent. It's the most expensive place to live in the United States. 154% higher than the national average. And I'm not going to even get into what happens when you factor in the cost of childcare. Also, if you're thinking, yeah, but they could live outside of Manhattan. Yeah, but most of the places within a reasonable commute still have ridiculously high rents. And I can tell you from personal experience that the phrase reasonable commute is meaningless in Manhattan. I lived in Queens on a subway line that went straight direct into the Upper West Side, which was where the nonprofit where I taught writing workshops was located. It took an hour for me to get to my class, not during rush hour, on a good day when there were no MTA shenanigans. And I attempted to actually drive it once, and only once in the 7 years that I lived there, and it took 2.5 hours. The distance was 8 miles. There is no such thing as a reasonable commute in Manhattan if you live outside of Manhattan, and even if you live in Manhattan, it's still pretty unreasonable. And also, let's not forget that a lot of these editorial positions and marketing positions and publicity positions, they're saying baseline salary, but to get in, you have to do an unpaid internship first. And that right there is a huge barrier to entry for most people. This isn't the first time I've said this, and certainly people have been making this argument for years, but if publishers actually really want to address the lack of diversity within their houses, this is where they need to start. Because when you require people to work for free before offering them a baseline salary that is still really only kind of part-time based on the cost of living of the area in which you are located, you know who's gonna apply for jobs at your company? Privileged people. People with wealthy spouses, people, with family money, people who can afford to live in or around Manhattan without relying on the salary you're paying them. Now, I am not saying that everyone who works at these houses is that privileged, not at all. There are experienced editors and marketing directors and publicists at these houses who work tirelessly at a job for a company that pays them far less than what they deserve. And then you throw a pandemic and a year and a half of trying to work from home when your job really isn't conducive to working from home on top of all of that, and it should be no surprise to any of us that burnout is very real in this industry right now. Here's a piece from Publishers Lunch a few weeks ago about how these houses are handling burnout. The Princeton University press teams are taking a week for renewal and wellness. It's the latest measure taken by a publisher to help combat the stresses of the past year and a half. Macmillan reportedly shuts down the first Monday of every month for a wellness day, and Hachette has held small group meetings with social workers. Penguin Random House has subsidized backup dependent care and instituted no meeting Fridays, among other wellness and work from home resources. Some companies have given additional days of PTO, and as part of their diversity efforts, the Big Five publishers and others have increased starting salaries. If this is an increase that happened since the Macmillan $42,000 increase, please let me know in the comments. I couldn't find any evidence of that. I think that's the increase that they're referring to, and that's great, but it's not enough. Since last year, many people have reported increased workloads, often due to pandemic-related changes in publication schedules, fears of layoffs and furloughs, lack of childcare, additional DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion work, particularly for BIPOC employees, and personal anxiety, grief, and depression over COVID, racist violence, and the 2020 election. One children's publishing staffer said, "This burnout is not normal. I think with any job, the good and the bad ebbs and flows, but this is beyond anything I have experienced or that I think my friends have experienced." And I know, probably everyone watching, we all experienced this together, regardless of our jobs, regardless of what industry we work in. It wasn't just that most of our jobs got harder to do because of the conditions imposed by the pandemic. It was also just that it was harder to focus. Here are a few quotes from more publishing professionals in this article. "Personally, my reading life definitely took a hit. I felt very restless all the time. The sirens were an incessant and deeply upsetting reminder of what was happening in the world around, while I attempted to cobble together a life that was still somewhat normal. I just wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing from minute to minute. I couldn't find relaxation in a task that required stillness and concentration when I was stressed out about a deadly virus. I was closed to queries for the longest time because of difficulty reading, and I opened up recently, mostly out of just guilt. Like, I need to be open to queries, but I'm embarrassingly behind." Yeah, the guilt, because when you work in publishing, you have people, including your authors, relying on you and you don't want to let them down. One editor said, "There are people who really agreed to trust me with their books and that's their livelihood, what they're using to support their families. And if I'm late on edits by 2 weeks because we're in the middle of a pandemic and I'm overwhelmed and sad, that is valid, but it doesn't help them." Then the piece also gets into the guilt added on top of that we all felt if we weren't essential workers. It's like, yes, I'm glad to have a job, but this is unheard of. This is unprecedented to have to do this and still do a job that feels important but not essential. It's weird because you're like, art is really crucial, but at the same time, nurses are doing way more important work, and I feel like we should be giving them stuff, not just clapping at 7. I think, especially in publishing, there was this sense of we have no right to complain because we are still employed and able to work from home. I'm lucky enough to still have a job, and that cannot be said for millions of people. I have no right to complain, right? But I think there's also this lack of understanding of what it meant to work through the pain, not in a frontline job, but in a job that's already kind of thankless and grueling in a lot of ways. On top of that, BIPOC employees often took on additional DEI work, plus the trauma of the news, as publishers grappled with systemic racism last summer and sold thousands of anti-racist books. One agent said, "At a certain point, it all catches up to you and you're trapped in your house, doom scrolling, unable to do anything but experience the intensity of grief paired with anger at the levels of anti-blackness in the US and in publishing." One employee who saw her long-standing DEI efforts fast-tracked last summer said that speedy push into the spotlight put additional stress on her and other staffers of color. "We're having to do the DEI work on top of editorial work, with the same pay, no advancement. It is emotionally exhausting, mentally exhausting, and that kind of exhaustion wears on your body." Okay, stop. Let's look at that again. Publishers, CEOs, the millionaires at the top talked some big game and made some big statements about diversity and inclusion last summer. And then they put the actual work of implementing these promised positive changes at their companies on staffers of color, the ones already suffering from systemic racism within the industry, with no raise and no promotion. All that stuff about the weird guilt cycle, I felt all of those feelings too last year. Like, I don't know what's going on and I'm freaked out, and because I feel this freaked out, I don't think I can work, but I'm lucky to have the work, but my work isn't even essential, and what about the doctors and nurses, and oh my god, now I'm freaked out again, and on and on and on. So I have nothing but empathy for the publishing employees who went through that too, and I have no bitterness whatsoever truly about the fact that, yeah, I've had several books bumped, and I've had several advances that I should have received earlier also bumped because of the pandemic. I understand. And I also have nothing but resentment and loathing for these virtue signaling assholes at the top of these companies who made grandiose statements about standing with marginalized communities, then burdened staffers of color even more with emotionally traumatizing unpaid labor, while simultaneously throwing millions of dollars in advance money at their oppressors. I mean, it's no wonder that those at the top of these publishing houses profit off of the words of others, because deep down they must know their own words are worthless. Obligatory explanation for anyone out there ready to call me out for being pro-censorship: not getting a book deal is not censorship. Everyone is free to write their thoughts and publish them. Private companies are not obligated to give anyone a book deal. I'm not saying people with beliefs that aren't aligned with my own should not get book deals. Not at all. What I am saying is that if a company chooses to give an individual in a position of power who uses that power to oppress marginalized people millions of dollars to publish their book, said company has no business making statements that they stand with those marginalized communities. I am not calling them out for the book deals. I'm calling them out for the hypocrisy. This piece also mentions literary agent Jennifer Lauren's really great post that went kind of viral within the publishing writing community earlier this summer about why querying is still so slow and why publishing in general is still so slow. She detailed a timeline of how the pandemic has affected the book industry over the past year and a half, including moved publication dates, working from home, layoffs, bookstore closures, supply chain issues, and personal anxiety. She wrote, It's not actually normal yet in publishing world because again, there's still that backlog and everyone is still working from home, which is okay, but honestly still makes things slower for a number of reasons. And look, everyone is just exhausted, okay? It's been a lot. Many employees report that their direct managers have been supportive of their struggles and that colleagues understand what they are going through. Still, lower level employee stress seems at odds with what some saw of some senior staff across the industry, whose quarantine digs seemed more like vacation homes or whose grown children didn't need constant attention. On top of that, some people report limitations on overtime pay, which can make a big difference to workers under the $58,500 threshold. And while workers appreciate the steps companies have taken to help them deal with stress, they're not always enough. So what really could help? Some have suggested increased staff across departments. The minute you can do the work and they see you could do the work, well, why do you need more people? Because you effectively published 60 books last year with the staff you've had. Yeah, because me and my staff killed ourselves to do that. So here we are again. Like Andrew told us back in my video about the mid-list, these employers would still rather burn out their employees to save a little bit more money. Throwing a 7-figure deal at a debut author? Sure, but let's underpay our editorial staff and then when one of them quits, not fill the position so we can save that $42,000 a year. The hard part is the best way to avoid burnout is for an editor to see fewer submissions and handle fewer books. But publishers generally don't want that as title count drives revenue. Authors and agents certainly don't want that as they want as many markets for their work as possible, and editors ourselves often don't want that as we are ambitious and we want to do all the cool books. I mean, okay, I'm no business owner, but let me think here. Staff more people, acquire more titles, throw some marketing money at more than 2 of those titles, everybody wins? And it's not like these houses are suffering financially. Soaring book sales have been good news for the business. Bertelsmann and HarperCollins reported record high sales for the last fiscal year. Some expressed hope on social media, always a bold thing to do, that publishers would reinvest those gains in additional personnel. LOL. Others indicated to us that they wish companies would genuinely acknowledge the effort that it took to get there and the toll the past year and a half has taken on staff. So the publishing houses themselves are actually doing well financially, which means the guys at the top are doing well financially, but editors are still suffering and not doing well financially, and acquisitions are slower, and that means that literary agents are suffering and not doing well financially, and that means that authors are not, doing well financially, and isn't it supposed to trickle down? Why isn't it trickling down? So once again, this traditional publishing video got bleak. And every time this happens, I get a lot of comments on the video saying, this is why I self-publish, or Michelle, this is why you should self-publish. And I have no issue with those comments, to be clear. I get it. Believe me, I understand what you're saying. But here's the thing. I live in Texas, and my state has recently been in the news for some pretty horrifying reasons. And there's been a lot of joking, not joking about how people who live here should run for their lives, flee, abandon the state. Why would anybody want to live here? And I read a really great article last week written by a Texas resident who was like, no. It's the opposite of that. We don't want people to leave. We need more people to come in, because there are a lot of great reasons to live in Texas. Texas is a wonderful place to live for tons and tons of reasons. And there are millions of wonderful people here who believe in basic human rights and democracy. And we need more of them. A city or state or a country or a company that's mostly populated with good, decent people, but is under the stranglehold of a greedy few. The answer is not to abandon those places. The answer is to bring more good in. More people willing to do whatever they can to bring about more positive changes. If I personally ever self-publish a book, it's not going to be because I'm so disgusted with traditional publishing that I just bail on it. To me, they're just 2 very different industries. So if I ever go the self-publishing route, it'll be because I think that's the best path for whatever that book is. So if you are pursuing traditional publishing, if you feel like that is the best path for you, don't let any of this discourage you. In fact, I hope it motivates you, because the industry needs you. The industry needs your voice. It needs your stories. It needs your ethics. It needs your values. And because I do want to end on a more positive note, I want to point out that traditional publishing is a very slow to change, but it has been changing. Look at last summer, which we spent a lot of time talking about in this video. After an industry-wide day of action protest against racism organized by 5 Macmillan employees, the CEO stepped back. His statement: "It is clear that we have to change who occupies the seats at the table when the important decisions are being made." Now, he's still involved. The piece says he remains in charge of the publisher's global businesses, but US publishing, which includes imprints like Tor, Henry Holt, and FSG, will now be handled by a 13-person committee, which his statement says will be, quote, "a different and more inclusive management team representing a wider range of experiences." And that was the result of 5 employees at Macmillan taking action. Traditional publishing is changing in a lot of ways for the better. And yes, it's way more slow than we want it to be, but it's still happening. So if you feel like this is the path for you, I really hope you'll join it, because then the change might happen even a little bit faster. If you're new here, this video is part of an ongoing traditional publishing series I have, which I will link over here, and I hope you'll subscribe and check out more of my videos. And that's it. I will see you guys on Friday with another vlog. Bye.